Okay, welcome everyone to the first workshop or seminar. There are two topics that I'm going to be covering. The first one is finding a research topic, and the second one is refining the title and argument. The slides that I'm using are basically from Introduction to Research, or INRS 7311, which those of you who are at Varsity College would have done in third year. I mean, research is fairly consistent, so this theoretical stuff is going to be the same regardless of where you do it. And I just want to point out that the page numbers and references come from the textbook Research Matters, Deploy Cilliers, Davis, and Besaida Notes, 2014. Okay, so the first thing is thinking about a particular topic. And I don't want to get too complicated with this. I think the first thing that you need to think about is something that interests you. Okay, so you're going to be doing a lot of reading on this topic. You're going to be trying to understand it. And even though this is just an honors level research project, if you end up doing masters, if you end up doing PhD, if you end up doing any research later on, it's useful to start off with something that you find fascinating, because you're going to be spending a lot of time on it, regardless of whether it's, just this year or if it kind of carries on forward. Having said that, what I found with a lot of students is that they will choose topics that are not really feasible. So a very important thing when you are choosing your topic is that you have some sense of what the research process is about. You need to understand that there are ethical limitations in terms of what you can do, and this is very difficult to get into students' heads even after you spend an hour telling them that there are ethical limitations. The topics that are suggested reveal very little understanding of how you can negatively affect participants by speaking to them about certain things. So you need to just be very aware of ethics. You need to be aware that the types of questions that you can ask them can trigger painful memories, that they may not be willing to talk about various things. You have to be practical about this. So when you're choosing a topic, think of something and think about gathering information from somebody. Realize that when you're doing research, you're going to have to go to a group of people and ask them certain questions. Will they give you answers to those questions? Will you be able to get to the group of people that you're trying to find information out from, or trying to get information from? And will they give you honest answers? Those are things that are very important. The point of understanding research or doing research, particularly at an honors level, is to get better at doing research. It's not necessarily to solve some great world problem. So you should be, while you should find a topic that really interests you, you should also be relatively conservative in terms of how much you're trying to find out. You can demonstrate your ability to do research very well without choosing a topic that is incredibly difficult to do practically. So those are some things to keep in mind. Okay, so just going through the slide, does the topic impact you, your community, or society as a whole? At the end of the day, you're going to have to motivate to whoever's reading your research why you're doing the research. So what's the rationale? What's the relevance? Who cares about the research that you're doing? So if you're going to answer some sort of question, which is basically what research is about, you need to be able to say, well, if I do answer this question, it's going to have some usefulness. It's going to help somebody else answer another question. It's going to allow people to live more happily. It's going to solve some sort of problem that exists in the world. It's going to contribute to knowledge in some sort of way. So that question of who cares should kind of be floating around in your mind the whole time that you're thinking about a particular topic. So where do these topics come from? I've said direct experience and observation. So, I mean, I've had students who want to do research on the experience of, stigma with mental illness. Difficult one to do because of the ethical sort of things. It is maybe possible to get around some of these like ethically difficult things if you don't speak to the people with the disorders themselves. If you speak to mental health professionals and say, what is your understanding of stigma and how it affects people, that might be considered to be ethical research. But then you have to think about, will I be able to go and get the time of 5 psychiatrists who all charge, 1,500 Rand an hour. So those are just some practical things that you need to think about. I've had students that want to find out whether when you get older, life seems better or worse. I've had students that want to find out the impact of various social media things on a person's sense of self and their sense of whether they feel that they're doing well or bad, or badly in the world. So think about things that are going on in your own life. Think about things that you might have been impacted by, and try to find a topic. But at the same time, remember that they're ethical and practical limitations. So those things should be kind of in your mind the whole time that you're sort of thinking about it. So I've said direct experience and observation. And the example I gave with, it seems that people who own PlayStations do better in class. That's a correlation that you may have picked up. So you might want to test to see whether it's true. You might want to try and understand why this might be true. And the way that you're trying to answer the question and the question that you're asking will determine the research approach that you use. So whether you use a qualitative method or quantitative method, whether you use interviews, focus groups, or questionnaires, or whatever, it all starts off with what your topic is and what your research question is. Those things will guide the rest of your research. Having said that, it is possible that you may have an automatic preference for a particular style of research. So you may think, I want to do a qualitative study, and then that will kind of guide the topic and the research question that you're asking as well. Or it will place limitations on the questions that you can ask and how well you can answer them. So again, there's a fair amount of kind of complexity, but it's relatively practical as well. Okay, maybe something from your social context, something about your family, your place of education. I've had a lot of topics relating to that from students, your tradition, your culture, your religion. Again, I've had students saying, does culture play a role in the emphasis on education? And does this affect how people from a particular culture perform in class? If education is valued highly, then maybe they will perform better. If education is not valued that highly, or maybe there's some skepticism about the type of education that's being provided, then perhaps people from this culture won't perform as well. So those are all questions that seem relevant to the students in question, and because they're relevant, they're going to put effort into them because they really want to know the answers. Okay, so you can use theories and previous research as a starting point for your own research. This can be a little bit tricky to do. In my PhD, I tried to combine two theories. One was the manic defense hypothesis, which is kind of psychoanalytic Freudian theory from about 1909 or 1911, I think. And then the dopamine hypothesis of bipolar disorder. Both of them relate to bipolar disorder, which is what my research was on. And I tried to basically combine this psychoanalytical theory with a more neurobiological theory. And that sounds complicated, but there are lots of theories that may be a lot simpler, that you're more familiar with, that might be a useful starting point for deciding what to do research on. The media is also very useful because it tells us what's going on at the moment. So for example, the coronavirus is a massive thing at the moment. So a lot of students, even after giving topics, have kind of come back to me now and said, well, I'd like to understand how students feel like the coronavirus and learning from home is affecting their motivation, whether it's improving things for them, whether they're finding out things about themselves that are good or that are bad. I've asked my own honors students to do research in addition to their own research, to basically do research on, for example, the benefits of the coronavirus, and to do a thematic analysis on, so it's basically to conduct a kind of an open-ended questionnaire, and then to do a thematic analysis on what other students say. And a lot of the things that come up are things like it gives you more time, and then within more time, you can find out, for example, it gives you more time to exercise, more time to focus on family and relationships, more time to do various other things. So time would be one of the main themes that comes from that research. Something else that may come from it might be something like saving money. So while people are maybe not able to work at the moment, they're not spending money on petrol, they're not spending money on traveling back and forth to varsity, they're not going to restaurants, to bars, that sort of thing as much. So you can do research that's very topical, and often the media can provide you with a good sense of what is topical at a given time. Okay, so I've said find something that interests you, that you can realistically find the answer to. Again, that's that practical side of things. Will you be able to access the people who are going to be able to give you this answer? So your population, will you be able to find a sample of people from that population that will sit with you and give you answers in terms of interviews or focus groups, or that will answer a questionnaire that you send to them, which tends to be more related to surveys and often quantitative research. So can you realistically find the answer to it? Do you have the time, the resources, and the connections to find the answer? So maybe I've kind of confused answerability and feasibility there. So answerability is basically, can the question be answered? So some people will set research questions like, what things will turn the South African economy around? I had BCom students a year or two ago, and some of their questions were like, well, you're not going to figure that out on your own in half a year. That's the sort of question that teams of economists with PhDs are working together to try and work out, and they don't really know the answer to. So that would be more like answerability. And then feasibility is more those sort of practical things. So do you have the time, the resource, and the connections to find the answer to the thing? So for example, I was thinking of doing my PhD research on the impact of stress on different parts of the brain. There are two major problems with that. Practically, it's very difficult, or you can't ethically put people through an incredible amount of stress, which is the first thing. And the second thing is that it costs about 20,000 Rand for a functional MRI scan. And if you've got to do at least 20 people in your sample, that's going to cost a lot of money. So think about the practical limitations. Okay, so find a topic that's specific, but not too specific. So when you're identifying the group of people that you're going to be dealing with, when you're identifying the question that you're trying to solve, is it going to be solving or finding an answer that relates to a certain group of people in terms of an age group, in terms of a culture, in terms of a region that they're in terms of whether they're students or from a particular profession. You don't want it to be too broad, because if you've got a small sample, which is likely going to be the case in an honors project, then your small sample's not really going to be representative of the entire target population. If you've got a more focused group of people in terms of the population parameters or the characteristics of people in the population, then it's far more likely that your small sample is going to be more representative of that group of people. So that's kind of an important thing to think about. And then finally, I've said, and I've kind of said it before, will this research add value to someone? Okay, so I've said as an example, if owning a PlayStation does correlate with better marks, this may result in further research and perhaps finding that gaming improves problem solving, for example. So what usefulness is your research going to have to someone? Okay, I think this slide is kind of nice just as a sort of summary. So you start off with your topic, then you get onto your research problem or your problem statements. You need to come up with a research question, which is basically a single sentence, very simple question, and then your research purpose. So why are you doing the research? And those three things kind of sit together underneath the research topic. In terms of the research question, just going through it again, answerability, can you answer the question? Feasibility, do I have the time, the resources, etc., to solve it? The scope, is my scope too broad or is it too narrow? Am I trying to answer too big a question and I'm going to kind of get a very vague answer to this big thing? Or is my scope so narrow that even if I do get the answer, it addresses such a small group of people or such a small question that it doesn't really matter? So is my scope the right sort of size? The theoretical value, will my research help to understand something about this topic? Will it add something of value? And then the relevance. So if you do understand this topic, does it make a difference to anyone else? So does it add value to someone else? Okay. Moving on, I just want to go through a problem statement because this has kind of got to do with refining the title and the arguments. And I'll get to the title right at the end. But the research problem or the problem statement, the way that I teach it to my students is basically to break down the problem statement into 5 major steps. Okay, so the whole point of research is to solve the research problem. So a research problem is an area of concern, a condition to be improved, a difficult to be eliminated, or a troubling question that exists in scholarly literature, in theory or in practice, that points to the need for meaningful understanding and deliberate investigation. It's something that you want to work out, that you've got a question and you want to figure it out, and it's going to help in some way. Okay, so problem statements, the 5 steps that I ask students to use in their problem statements. And initially, I'll ask them to put it in these 5 different steps. But obviously, when you write the problem statement out, you don't have to have identify a problem and then identify the problem. You don't have to have explain why it is a problem and then explain why it's a problem. You just have what the problem is, why it's a problem, what's not known, etc. So the first thing is identify a problem and explain why it's a problem. And those 2 things can kind of go together. So in this example, I've said, okay, well, children seem to be playing more violent video games. And then the second part is that this may lead to a greater likelihood of violent behavior in later life. So there's kind of already a sort of thinking that, this thing that's going on may be causing some sort of problem. The third thing that you do is you explicitly state what is not known, because the whole point of your research is to uncover something that's not known. So you might say, for example, currently it is not known whether playing these games does lead to violent behavior. Okay. The 4th step is basically a direct follow-on from the 3rd step. So if you're saying that it's not known whether these games lead to violent behavior, the next thing to do is to basically say what the research aims to find out. In this case, you just say, this research aims to find out if there is a relationship between playing violent video games and violent behavior. So it's addressing the thing that's not known in number 3. And then very briefly, you're providing in your 5th step part of the rationale and relevance of the research. So if you've got a section on rationale and relevance, it would be in a lot more detail. In terms of the problem statement, the way that I like to see them, this step 5 is a much more brief sentence that explains very, basically why this research adds value. So I've said here, if there is a positive correlation or positive relationship between playing violent video games and violence, this may inform policy decisions on limiting the manufacture and distribution of these games to children under a certain age. Okay, so the problem statement needs to explain what the problem is, explain why it's a problem, explain what's not known, explain what the research plans to find out, and explain why anyone would care about this finding if you are able to find it out. It needs to be quite concise, quite contained, and basically just to provide a brief look for somebody who's trying to understand your research to be able to kind of go, okay, I understand what this person's trying to do. I understand what they're trying to find out and why, and I understand the usefulness of this research. You can expand on all of these things later on in other sections. The rationale and relevance, for example, the purpose of the research is basically the step number 4 is kind of like the purpose of the research. Step number 5 is kind of the rationale and relevance, but you can expand on these things later on in those sections or in part of your literature review. Okay, so I've got some examples here that I think you can just kind of go through on your own, and just the difference in terms of problem statements written by somebody from a positivist paradigm, which is the example here. Hopefully you can see all 5 of these steps in this problem statement. So you should be able to identify the parts where this person is identifying the problem, where they're explaining why it's a problem, where they're explaining what's not known, explaining what the planned research aims to find out, and then explaining why it's important. There you've got another example. Again, you should be able to work through the 5 steps there. This is an example from an interpretivist paradigm. And then finally, I've given an example from the position of critical realism. Okay. Okay, so what does the slide have to say? Okay, so after the research problem statement and research purpose have been stated, it is important to ensure that the problem meets the criteria for answerability, feasibility, scope, theoretical value, and relevance. So keep referring back to those things. Once you've come up with your title and you've kind of thought about your problems, your research problem or your problem statements, go back and kind of go, can it be answered? Can you answer it? Is the scope too broad or too narrow? What is the value of actually figuring this out? Or will it add some value to this, to the understanding of this topic? And who cares? What's the relevance? Okay. Finally, guys, just the way that I like the title to be laid out. And I think it's useful for lecturers to kind of use this, particularly with third year and honors students as a starting point. If students, so guys, if you put these, your titles in this format, it already provides a very good sense of what your research is about, how you're planning to go about doing it, and whether you understand the kind of golden thread. So the idea of linking the type of question that you're asking to the topic, to the methodology, whether you understand who your target population is, and whether you've got some sort of sense of the data collection technique that may be used with the methodology that you're using. So in a title, I basically ask students to include these 5 things. Point 1 is the type of research question. And generally, I ask the students to differentiate between exploring, describing, or explaining. So the very first word that's used in the title should be exploring, describing, or explaining. And that gives a sense of the type of research question that's being asked. And you can go into your notes and find out what the difference is between those things. Generally, something that's exploratory is going to be qualitative. Describing could be qualitative or quantitative, and explaining is likely to be some sort of correlational research or experiment of some type. Okay, so the first thing, exploring, describing, or explaining. In this case, I've used exploring. The second thing should give a sense of what the topic is. So in this case, it's the impact of social media on self-esteem. So immediately the person reading this knows the type of research, the way that you're kind of going to be going about trying to figure the thing out, and they'll understand what your topic is. Then break this up with a colon, because otherwise the title tends to get a bit long-winded. So you've got a colon after that. And after that, what I like students to do is to explicitly state their methodology. So is it qualitative, or is it quantitative, or is it mixed methods? But don't do mixed methods. It just complicates things. Is it qualitative or quantitative? Unless you're very comfortable with mixed methods and are able to integrate a complicated paradigm that maybe relates to that, I would suggest sticking to qualitative or quantitative. So the third thing you would say, for example, a qualitative study. Okay. The fourth thing is the target population. So it's a qualitative study on university students, or it might be on people with diabetes, or it might be on academics at tertiary institutions in Johannesburg. Whatever your target population is, that should be the next thing that's in there. And then finally, you need to state what your data collection method is going to be. So in this case, I've said, because it's exploring, it's probably qualitative, which means that the data collection method is going to probably be in-depth interviews or focus groups. As third year or honors students, I would generally suggest staying away from focus groups. There are a number of problems with focus groups. If you don't get them right the first time round, then don't get any data. At least with interviews, you can kind of mess up the first time you do it, get a bit better the second time, and by the time you've done 5 or 6 of them, you may actually be relatively competent at doing those in-depth interviews. So the total title with everything in it is Exploring the Impact of Social Media on Self-Esteem, a qualitative study on university students, using in-depth interviews. Again, like with the problem statements, very structured. There are 5 steps. If you've got those 5 steps in there, it gives you a sense of whether you understand what your project is going to be about, and it gives your lecturer or your supervisor a very nice brief outline of what your research is and what to kind of expect going forward. Okay, hopefully that was useful. Yeah, thanks for your time.